Greetings and welcome to another edition of Montpelier Connection. We're broadcasting here from the statehouse. My name is Representative Mike Mrowicki from the Windham District of Putney, Dummerston, and Westminster. Today we're joined by Representative Dick Marek of Newfane. Thanks, Dick, for coming.
Pleasure to be here.
Dick works on the House Judiciary Committee, so they have quite a full agenda this term, and we're going to take a look at a few things that are right before us. Yesterday, the House Judiciary Committee and the House Human Services Committee that I work on held a joint hearing on opioid addiction, treatments, and hopefully protocols as we move forward, because most of the people who are addicted to opioids now are doing it legally through prescription drugs. And I think one of the things that jumped off the report that was offered by the Vermont Medical Society was from the state medical examiner saying he's seeing 1 death a week now from recreational drug use of prescription opioids. So it's a startling figure in a small state like Vermont, and I think is indicative of the scope of the problem. Dick, you sit on Judiciary, I sit on House Human Services, but there's a bridge between what we're doing. How do you define the problem that we're trying to address here?
Well, I think as you articulated, opioids are the biggest substance abuse problem in the state, probably except for alcohol, which we tend to forget is a drug. And we've worked on my committee very substantially on DUI issues over the years. We've also worked on a whole range of drug-related issues. Opioids are prescription drugs by and large. There's also heroin, but heroin actually tends to be a relatively limited problem in Vermont. The fact that they are prescription drugs doesn't necessarily mean that it is a prescriber and the patient who are the direct conduit. There are a couple of channels. One is a person who really games the system and goes to multiple doctors. And
the doctor shopping.
The doctor shopper. And we've been working on trying to come up with some mechanisms, better mechanisms, to help identify situations such as that, because we don't, as far as we know, at least in Vermont, at this point, have doctors who are individually simply becoming pill mills. But what we do have is people who will shop multiple doctors and go to multiple pharmacies to get their prescriptions filled. Identifying that as one area of control. Another problem is the person who gets a legitimate prescription for a substance like OxyContin, has it sitting in the medicine cabinet, and it gets diverted by someone else. And that is a little tougher to control because it's a one-off situation, but it's a real channel for opioids to get into illicit hands. And then the third one, which is, I think, even a bigger part of the problem, is simply the dealers who bring in illicit supplies of opioids for the purpose of selling them in the black market. And the profit margin is huge. We had testimony the other day that a prescription of 30 painkillers has a street market value of $2,400. So there's a huge profit margin, as there is with other illicit drugs. So it's a multifaceted problem in terms of controlling supply. The other piece that I think is equally important, and maybe even in some ways more important, is identifying ways to get more and more people into treatment, because one of the really frustrating problems in Vermont is we have individuals who desperately want to get off their addiction. They want to get into a program, and there are long waiting lists. And it strikes me as the height of irony that at the same time we're trying to interdict supplies, we have people who want to get off their addiction and can't get into a program. That to me is just penny wise and pound foolish.
You've spoken to already several facets. There have been some who were trying to make this seem like a simple problem, like this is a law enforcement problem. I know that the administration has been asking us to ease restrictions on access to the registry that we have, the online monitoring system. Thoughts on that?
Well, we dealt with that last year, and people sometimes think when you have the same political party in control of the legislature and the governorship that everything is easy and straightforward and we all agree with each other. That's far from the truth, as we both know. there's a registry that is supposed to contain all prescriptions for opioids. It was set up for the health department to be able to monitor prescribing practices and patient availability of drugs, the people who might be prescription shopping with different doctors. It was set up solely for use by the health department, and we had a request last year to open that database up with all the patient information in it for many legitimate patients. The vast majority are totally legitimate. Open that up to certain law enforcement officers so that they could go through it and look for illicit prescriptions. We had a fundamental problem with that from a couple of standpoints. First of all, it was going to open up a huge amount of confidential patient information to people who were not part of the health care universe. And one of the areas that we've been very careful about trying to protect confidentiality is personal patient information. The second problem is a really fairly fundamental one, and that is that we have a process by which law enforcement could get into that database if it demonstrated a need. It's called a warrant. And warrants are the traditional mechanism by which law enforcement obtains information that isn't in the public domain. And we ask the question, first of all, what percentage of the opiate abuse in Vermont is derived from prescription shopping as opposed to the other things I talked about, diversion of legitimate prescriptions by somebody who just takes it out of the medicine cabinet, or opioids that are brought in to be sold illegally. And the answer we got was a very tiny percentage. The second problem is we said, have you ever sought a warrant to get into this database? Have you ever once asked a judge to do what judges do? And that's look at whether or not you've established a reasonable probable cause basis for wanting to look at this, and ask the judge to give you a warrant. And the answer was no, we've never sought a warrant. So we said, well, then why should we just totally ride over the normal process for getting that information? So there was a fundamental difference between us and the governor, and frankly us and the Senate.
Yeah.
And I don't think the House's position on that, or the Judiciary Committee's position, is likely to be all that different this year until it's demonstrated that there's a compelling, that it really is going to fundamentally address the problem first, and secondly, that you have even tried to get a warrant. I think it's premature.
That, as you said, that's a small part of this problem. And in our committee, we took testimony because our committee took the lead and eventually tried to reconcile with the Senate Judiciary Committee, and we did not. We took testimony from the state police. How hard is it to get a warrant? And one of the responses was, well, here's an example. State trooper pulls somebody over on the highway. The car smells like marijuana. The occupants are asked, can we search the vehicle? They say no. The state trooper goes back to his car, phones a judge, gets a warrant within minutes, and has a legal warrant. It doesn't take long. So I think, like you said, it's really opening up a can of worms to open the electronic records, which we're trying to convince people are safe, for scrutiny that might not be needed.
Well, I think, it's important to have good law enforcement. It's part of the picture. But ultimately, no matter how good a job our law enforcement people do, and no matter what tools we give them, it's a supply and demand issue in Vermont as anywhere else. And you've got a illicit substance that's highly profitable, highly transportable, big demand for it, and you have dealers who will find a way to fill that demand. If you believe in the free market, then I think ultimately you have to accept that the most effective way to deal with drug abuse is not through interdiction, because someone will find a way to supply the demand if the demand's there. It's to deal with the demand end of the cycle effectively. At the same time, you're trying to cut off supply to the extent you can.
One of the structural pieces we heard yesterday was again contained within that report from the Vermont Medical Society, where they made the point that they feel like insurance companies' practices are actually pushing people in the direction of using drugs. The quote was, for example, with chronic low back pain, acupuncture, massage, chiropractic are found to be helpful, and yet many insurance companies won't cover them, but they will cover prescribing Percocet, which has not been found to be helpful. So this just does not make sense, and it certainly makes one think that it's market pressures from big pharma that are pushing things in this direction. The other piece that was pointed out was, I think your chair pointed out, that there seems to be some speculation that drug manufacturers are producing more drugs than their prescriptions for. To what end?
Yeah. Well, diversion is certainly a major piece of supply. And, you know, given the economics, when a single vial of 30 pills is worth $2,400, a warehouse or a truck that has a full load has just almost an astronomical value. I mean, that truck might as well be filled with gold bullion in terms of the desirability from the thief's standpoint of taking it and diverting it. And there is diversion at that level, and that is a significant piece of the problem, and very difficult to interdict.
Moving on to a cousin to this, we are looking at marijuana, a relaxing of laws. Decriminalization has been put forward. Is there a bill in your committee?
I don't know if it's on the wall yet, but it certainly will be there shortly. We're, as you know, we're in the middle of bill drafting season. We have deadlines to have bills drafted and bills introduced and bills to move through the first body to the other body. So I don't honestly know if it's on the wall yet. I don't think it is, but it will be. On the wall is when we get a bill and we put a little card on the wall to remind us that we've got it and what the number is and what the title is. But yeah, there will be a bill. The Speaker has indicated that we will take it up this year. It does not legalize marijuana. It simply decriminalizes, and there will probably be, I would assume, several versions of it introduced. And
what's the difference?
Well,
between decrim and
legalization essentially says, as in Colorado and I think one other state, Washington, that we are not going to prosecute possession of certain amounts of marijuana under state law. It still remains illegal federally. No state can waive the federal laws, but the states don't also have to directly use their law enforcement resources to enforce the federal laws. They can do that to the federal government. So Colorado had said up to a certain amount, we are not going to prosecute your possession of marijuana or small numbers of marijuana plants. And that was a public policy decision they took. Our proposals in Vermont do not go that far, although we may well see a bill to do that. The bill that would be taken up would simply say that possession of a low amount, probably an ounce or two, would not lead to a criminal citation. It would lead to a civil citation, so it would be like getting a traffic ticket. There would still be a penalty. It would still be against the law, but it would be against civil law, not criminal law. And the rationale for that is to some extent people who feel that we're going to save some law enforcement resources and judicial resources by not going through the form of prosecuting these really low-end possession crimes. Those people don't go to prison in the end, but what they do end up with is criminal record. And if you have a criminal record, even though it's for a misdemeanor amount of marijuana, it has the effect ultimately, and I think many people don't realize this because they plead guilty because they're told by the court you won't go to jail, you'll get a small fine, you'll be on probation for a few months. What they don't realize is when they go to get a student loan, they aren't going to qualify. If they go for housing assistance or other benefits, if they try to enlist in the military. So it has a huge number of collateral impacts that affect people potentially through their entire life because they pled to a very small criminal citation. If we convert that to a civil citation, they still will pay a penalty, they'll still have committed a violation, but they won't have all those collateral consequences. And that, to me, makes perfect sense. One can debate whether you're in favor of legalization ultimately or not, and that's a debate I suspect that maybe had another day, but this does not equal legalization. It's a very different thing.
Yeah. Now, Another topic that your committee is looking at is another drug problem in the state, and that's meth.
That's right. Yeah, we had done work on that a couple of years ago, and it's interesting. I've been on the Judiciary Committee now 10 years, and you will see the same issue pop up in different iterations over time as you work to fill the gaps in the law or correct laws that aren't adequate. A few years ago, because we were told that methamphetamine was a growing problem around the country that hadn't hit Vermont yet, we actually beat the federal government to requiring that the predecessor pharmaceuticals that are used as part of manufacturing meth, basically pseudoephedrine, which is in Sudafed and a couple other over-the-counter medications, we required that those be sold only behind the counter of pharmacies, and that a record be kept of the name and identity and address of the person buying them. Because what had been happening was people would come in and buy 10 packages of Sudafed in a given pharmacy and then go out and cook a batch of meth. So we beat the federal government actually by probably 6 months to put those requirements in place. What now is happening in Vermont, and manufactured meth has now arrived in Vermont. We're told by law enforcement that it's happening pretty much around the state. Fortunately, still at a fairly low level. The person who wants to create a batch of meth will get 4 or 5 other people to go around, and they'll seriatim go to 4 or 5 pharmacies. Each of them will walk in, buy a couple of packages, and there are limits on daily sales to an individual, but 4 or 5 people go in individually over a period of a few hours and visit 4 or 5 pharmacies, so you end up with a large number of boxes of Sudafed, and you go off. The other ingredients are all available in your local hardware store, so it's fairly easy to do this. There are a couple of problems that are sort of unique to meth. Number one is, based on some of the testimony we've had, it is exceedingly addictive. You can take an opiate and not be addicted, and obviously a lot of people use opiates for legitimate pain control and don't become addicted. Meth is incredibly addictive, so the first time or two you use it, you are an addict. Secondly, it creates a significant amount of violence. It is a drug that really turns people into uncontrollable, violent people, and it's exceedingly destructive to the individual. If you look at pictures of meth addicts, they look as though they're 60 years older than they actually are. The other thing it does is the manufacture of meth creates vapors and leaves residues, which are incredibly toxic. So people who rent an apartment and cook meth in it may have effectively destroyed that apartment. It made it very dangerous for anybody who comes in. When they go in to clean up meth sites, they literally wear full-body biohazard suits. So meth has that kind of profile. Opiates, and meth doesn't tend to lead, it may lead very heavily to violent crime, but it doesn't tend to lead to the property crimes. Opiate addiction, your problem is paying for the opiates, and so that tends to lead to an awful lot of the property crimes we see in the state.
So what is the bill that you're looking at, hoping to do?
Well, we're just getting started on that bill. One possibility would be to make the predecessor drug, Sudafed, and related drugs prescription only. We also had testimony from the police chief in Newport about a database which is in use in some states that lets a pharmacy immediately know if someone has come in and bought Sudafed in another pharmacy within a narrow time frame, so that the second pharmacy and ongoing pharmacy simply wouldn't sell. The group of people who are going around would be cut off after their first purchase. So you're essentially trying to cut off as much as you can the supply of the predicate chemical substances. The other ingredients are all things that you can buy in any hardware store, and we really have no way to interdict that. It wouldn't make any sense to try.
Well, we have a few minutes left. Before we go, I wonder if we could touch on something that's rather close to home for you.
Sure.
And it's about cell towers, cell tower placing.
Yes.
And the place or lack of place local input seems to have in this process.
I think local, we passed the bill to create a process to have cell tower siting, and we're trying to cover all the areas that aren't currently covered, which people desperately want, and I want, and I think we all collectively in the legislature want to see happen. We tried to create a process to have the Public Service Board take these applications and handle them. There was supposed to be a degree of opportunity for public input by the company that was going to provide these, and these final sites that we're trying to cover in the state are being subsidized by federal and state money because they simply aren't economically viable for a company to come in and do directly. The problem we've encountered, and I've encountered it in Newfane directly, and I know other communities around the state have had the same problem, is that the cell company will come in and only notify the community at the very end of the process. And the community really feels, I think very legitimately, it doesn't have adequate input to try to suggest alternative sites or to have the funding to hire an expert to analyze whether those sites are actually viable or not. So there's a balance to be drawn here between actually getting these things built on a timely basis and also giving and respecting the community's desire to have them properly sited. We had 2 sites in Newfane suggested, one of which the Select Board has done as effective a job as it can under the current law of trying to suggest alternatives for, but it's only been thwarted and it's been only able to get into it very late. The other site we heard about before it was being before it was put in front of the Public Service Board, which frankly as a legislator gave me more opportunity to put a voice in. Once it's in front of the PSB, it's in front of a quasi-judicial body, and I didn't feel in the first case that I could actually intervene at that point because it was in front of what essentially is a judge. But the other site was prior to that, and it was actually a suggestion that a 150-odd foot tower be put up on the Newfane Common. Not exactly a great site, and one that violated the PSB standards. So that was, and also violated a deed restriction on the common. So that one I think we were able to cut off early enough in the process. But if we had not heard about that until a little bit later, we would have had a much harder time debating it. And I was able to suggest 4 alternative possibilities, and I know others are also under consideration. So there are logical spots to put these, there are optimal spots to put them, and we ought to try to make sure they go in the right places. But we also need them because the governor has promised us all that by the end of this year we will all have broadband service, and I look forward to that day.
Well, it is one of the most common requests we get from constituents.
It is.
It does create the horns of a dilemma where most of us want it, where we want it to come from.
Well, it's critical to Vermont that we get this because I get more contact from people who say that they are not able to run a business in Vermont or to create a business in Vermont that they want to have. People who live in other states, New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, who say, look, I've got a place in Vermont, I'd love to be here full time, I'd love to run my business here, I can't do it without broadband, I can't do it with dial-up, I simply can't process the data I need to. So we are really, in terms of business and job growth in Vermont alone, as well as just personal convenience, we really need this.
Yeah. Well, thanks a lot, Dick.
Thank you
for taking time out of a busy day here, and thanks again also to the people at BCTV for bringing the State House a little closer to you at home. Until next time, this is Mike Mrowicki. Take care.